if you are someone who has been training for a while, you think you're training pretty smart, you think you're training pretty hard, you're doing training that should be effective, but you just look around and you think, man, like I just don't seem to be experiencing the gains that a lot of other people in my gym are, my training partners are. I don't seem to be getting the responses to training that I see elsewhere on social media. What are some things that I could potentially do to help rectify that and start making better gains? So the first thing you can do, and this is, may sound like a bit of a cop-out, but it's true, is just try to make sure you have your ducks in a row outside the gym. So, if you're not experiencing particularly large strength gains, training doesn't seem to be going well, but you're consistently sleeping 4 or 5 hours per night, just because you're getting up to tomfoolery, you can't turn off Netflix, can't get off social media. Like, your lifestyle would theoretically allow you to sleep 8 or 9 hours per night, but just due to sheer pigheadedness, you're sleeping 5 hours per night. Like, I don't know, maybe try to address that before you say like, I just don't respond well to training. Or, if you have the means to consume like 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body mass, but you just don't like to, and so you're consuming like 40 grams of protein per day. If you're not experiencing much muscle growth, that could be contributing. So I don't want to make it sound like everyone has the same capacity to fully get their ducks in a row outside the gym. Like, if poor sleep and recovery is leading to smaller strength gains, less muscle growth, but the reason that you're not sleeping as much is because you recently had kids, or because you have to work 2 jobs to make ends meet, or any number of other things. Like, I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, like if you don't design your lifestyle to look like a professional athlete, it's because you don't want it bad enough. Like, I'm certainly not saying that, but to the extent that is feasible, if there are ways that you can improve your nutrition, improve your recovery, that you simply haven't done to this point, even though they're feasible and reasonable for you to do so, maybe try those things first.
Yeah, that really hits close to home right now, because as you know, we had a hurricane rolling into town. Mm-hmm. And so what does my girlfriend do? She just leaves. She just gets out of town and leaves me with the cat.
Unbelievable.
So I'm over here trying to take care of the cat. It's a full-time job trying to take care of one cat. So like my sleep, my schedule, it's all out the window, So I'm doing my best, but man, chasing Izzy around the house has not been easy.
It's tough to be a single dad.
Yeah.
So the next thing you can do, and this is going to sound quite obvious, but it needs to be said, is just keep training. So if you're experiencing relatively small or relatively slow gains in fitness, gains in strength, gains in muscle mass, etc., small gains do add up over time. And that is almost self-evidently true, but let's bring a study into it just so we can look at some data. So this study is from Ross and colleagues from 2015. The title is Separate Effects of Intensity and Amount of Exercise on Inter-Individual Cardiorespiratory Fitness Response. And so in this group, or in this study, 3 different groups of people trained 5 times per week for 24 weeks. One of the groups basically just trained easy. So in each of their training sessions, the total amount of work they did was relatively small, and they performed it at a low intensity. In another group, they also exercised at a low intensity, but the total volume of work they did was twice as large as the first group. And then the third group, they did a lot of work per session, and they also trained at a higher intensity than the other 2 groups. And what you see in all 3 groups, so they assessed cardiorespiratory fitness at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 16 weeks, and 24 weeks. And in all 3 groups, what you see is that after just 4 weeks of training, there were quite a few individuals in every group that would be classified as non-responders, including the group that was doing quite a lot of training, so a high volume of training and at a high intensity. 11 out of 31 subjects would have been classified as non-responders after 4 weeks. And in the group, basically just training easy, so low intensity and a low total volume of training, 20 out of 34 subjects would have been classified as non-responders. So those were people who experienced either increases or decreases in aerobic fitness that were smaller than the typical measurement error for the equipment they were using. But then after 24 weeks of training in the really easy training group, the number of non-responders had gone down from 20 to 15. In kind of that middle group, the higher volume of low intensity training, the number of non-responders had gone down from 25 to just 9. And in the high intensity and high volume group, the number of non-responders had gone down from 11 to 0. So, just simply continuing the same training intervention will just lead to larger gains over time. As long as you are making progress adds up.
And this isn't like over like a 4-year timeline. I mean, we're talking about 24 weeks, right?
Yeah, so it's 6 months.
Yeah.
The next thing you can do, if you're not experiencing the sorts of gains you would like to see, is, and again, like this will potentially seem obvious, but again, it bears saying, is just to train more or train harder. So the prior study is a great illustration of this, the paper by Ross. So, as the amount of training increases, so the total volume, and as the intensity of training increased, the average gains in cardiorespiratory fitness got larger, and the proportion of people who would have been classified as non-responders got smaller. Another study that I'm pretty sure we've talked about on the podcast before also relates to this. This was by Montero and Lundby in 2017. Title is Refuting the Myth of Non-Response to Exercise Training, non-responders do respond to higher dose of training.
That's a good way to get people to read your paper or talk about it, is
Yes.
when your first thing is refuting the myth of blank.
Yeah, just like a really strong, audacious declaratory statement. At minimum, that's going to get people to click on your study.
And it's I said that a little bit facetiously, but I genuinely do appreciate it, because like we go through the journal sweep every month for Mass, and we sort it by title, and there's no fewer than like 75 studies that just start with effects of some boring shit on some other shit.
Yeah.
So I appreciate a bold title.
Oh, for sure. I mean, look, clickbait works, folks. Whether you like it or not, and clickbait works just as well on PubMed as it does on BuzzFeed or like YouTube. It's generalizably true. We live in the world of clickbait. It's time to just accept it. Here's the deal as well. Like, occasionally we'll put a clickbait title on something, and people in the comments, like not many, but occasionally they'll be like, this is clickbait. You clicked on it though. That's all I'm saying. Like, congratulations, you played yourself. It worked.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in this study, there were 5 groups of people who trained for 6 weeks at 60 minutes per session. And the groups either trained 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 times per week. And so basically the total volume of training and training intensity was the same in all 5 groups. So the total volume of training was simply determined by how many days per week they were training. And they found that for the groups training 1, 2, and 3 times per week, there were a reasonable number of folks who were non-responders in those groups. Again, people experiencing gains in aerobic fitness that were smaller than the measurement error for the device being used to assess fitness. And there were more non-responders training once per week than twice per week, and more non-responders training twice per week than 3 times per week. And there were no people who would have been classified as non-responders in the 4 and 5 times per week groups. And then in the second part of the study, they took the folks who were classified as non-responders during the first 6 weeks and said, hey, you're going to do 6 more weeks of training, but you're going to do an additional 2 sessions per week. So if you were previously just training once per week, now you're going to train 3 times per week. If you were training 2 times per week, now you're going to train 4 times per week. And if you were training 3 times per week, now you're going to be training 5 times per week. So those same people who were previously deemed non-responders following their first 6 weeks of training, they just do more training for another 6 weeks. And TLDR, none of them were non-responders anymore. Just increasing the dose of exercise increased the extent to which they responded to it. And like this likely generalizes to resistance training as well. Like we know that training volume is a factor that is strongly associated with hypertrophy responses. So, if you're not seeing the muscle growth you want and your training is overall fairly low volume, like you'll probably respond better to training by increasing that volume a little bit. All right. So those are, I think, the most obvious things you could do. Just stick at it. Try to get your ducks in a row outside the gym. And just try training more.
Yeah, I was smiling because I know someone's going to get in the comments and say like, oh, Greg, thanks for the evidence-based segment that tells people to do more and do better.
Yeah, I mean, but like that is true. But like I do think it's worth, so a dynamic that I think exists is like folks who respond worse to training than most people on average. Like if they do say anything about it, or maybe complain about it a little bit, like they'll often be met with just a wall of responses saying like, well, have you tried trying? Like, like why don't you just train harder? And like that, I think is often meant in kind of a what's the way? Not off-putting. What, like it's just like kind of in a dismissive way.
Yeah.
So what I'm at least attempting to do here is to not assume that everyone who's responding worse to training than average isn't trying and isn't putting in the work. Like I fully believe they are, and they just got a bad genetic draw, and like it is what it is.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to say, like, couched within that context, unfortunately, it is still true that training more will probably be beneficial. And I don't mean that in like a dismissive way. Like I just mean it in a it is probably true way.
Yeah, and we've mentioned in the past in various places that we do tend to lean toward the empiricist perspective when it comes to, reviewing evidence. And I do think it's beneficial. It's very easy to say, well, if you just do it for longer, I assume it will start working. I think it is very reassuring to say, oh yeah, here is empirical evidence of people who in the first phases of training struggled, but those gains did materialize over time. Like it is nice to have that confirmation, even though it's not a dazzling theory of do it for longer.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a good chunk of science is just confirming things that we already very strongly suspected to be true.
Yeah.
And this is just kind of in that category.
Yeah.
All right. So the fourth thing you could do is just measure more variables. Here is another nice, strong, declaratory, audacious statement from Churchward Vin and colleagues in 2015. Title of this study is "There Are No Non-Responders to Resistance-Type Exercise Training in Older Men and Women."
It's another great thing about titles. Sorry to butt in here, but
yeah.
Not only are they more fun and clickable, but if you were the type of person who only reads abstracts, with this one, you don't even have to do that.
That is true.
You just read the title.
Correct.
Say, wow, I know everything I wanted to know.
Yeah, I mean, the title itself is a pretty good TLDR. So in this study, it was a retrospective analysis of responses to 12 and 24 weeks of training in men and women who were at least 65 years old at the start of the study. And pre and post training, they assessed lean body mass via DEXA, type 1 and type 2 muscle fiber cross-sectional area via biopsy, 1 rep max strength for leg press and knee extensions, and physical function test, chair rise time test. Those were assessed at baseline, after 12 weeks of training, and after 24 weeks of training. And The thing to note is in this study, there were plenty of quote unquote non-responders for each discrete variable. Like there were plenty of people who didn't gain that much lean mass, plenty of people who didn't experience robust increases in fiber cross-sectional area, a handful of people who didn't experience strength gains, etc. But every single individual in this study experienced meaningful increases in at least one of these things. So, like, and the other thing to note, kind of going back to the second point of just keep training, for each discrete variable, there were fewer people who were deemed non-responders at 24 weeks than at 12 weeks. And here are two good quotes just from the abstract. Non-responsiveness was not apparent in any subject, as a positive adaptive response on at least one training outcome was apparent in every subject, and, quote, the level of responsiveness was strongly affected by the duration of the exercise intervention, with more positive responses following more prolonged exercise training. So, like, this will also, I think, be hard to say without potentially coming off as dismissive, but like there are benefits to training that you probably care about that may not be the number one main thing you're interested in, that if you just kind of are willing to expand the scope of the responses that you're willing to be interested in and assess and look at, there will probably be something that's going right for you. So if you're trying to, just gain as much muscle as possible head to toe, put on some strength, etc., and you're a low responder to hypertrophy style training, it could be that becoming a mass monster isn't in the cards, but you might have a muscle group or two that responds pretty well. So if you get more granular with your assessments, and instead of just looking at like total lean mass, you kind of look at like, oh, I'm going to take a upper arm circumference measure, lower arm circumference measure, upper thigh, calf, waist, chest, whatever. Like, you might find a few muscles that do respond pretty well. You can keep track of them, be proud of them. If you're trying to build muscle and get stronger, like there are just fewer strength non-responders than hypertrophy non-responders. So, I mean, like, even if you're not putting that much muscle on your frame, you will probably still get stronger and become generally more physically capable. Like, there are positive training related things that are happening, which may not necessarily be the just level A1 type thing you were the most interested in. Like there will probably still be plenty of physical aspects that are moving in the right direction. So if you're willing to just kind of like expand your horizons and look at more total variables, you will probably find something that is going pretty well for you.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the term mass monster, because it is something I wanted to clear up. A lot of people have asked me why because I had a really good thing going. I was a very successful pro natural bodybuilder. And a lot of people asked why I transitioned to pro natural classic bodybuilding, which was a pretty huge change of direction for me. And it really comes down to, like, for some people, being a mass monster just isn't in the cards, like you mentioned. But, for me, it was more of a stylistic thing. I was looking around the natural bodybuilding landscape, and it was just getting grotesque. Mm-hmm. I mean, you had these mass monsters getting on stage 165 pounds on these pro natural bodybuilding stages. So I'm glad that we've expanded the sport and opened up classic bodybuilding for a more streamlined and frankly less grotesque physique.
Yeah, totally fair.
Yeah.
Okay, so the fifth thing you could potentially do is experiment with different training styles. So I'm going to go back to the Carniero paper that I talked about quite a bit 2 episodes ago. Title is Different Load Intensity Transition Schemes to Avoid Plateau and No Response in Lean Body Mass Gain in Postmenopausal Women. And so I'm not going to talk about this study in a ton of detail again, because I already did 2 episodes ago. But just as a very brief refresher, this was a 24-week crossover study where subjects completed 12 weeks of training at a moderate intensity, so 8 to 12 rep max loads, and 12 weeks of training at a low intensity, so 27 to 31 rep max loads, in a randomized order. So half of them started with moderate load training for 12 weeks, followed by low load training for 12 weeks. And the other half just went the opposite order, 12 weeks of low load training, followed by 12 weeks of moderate load training. And as I discussed in the previous segment, some individuals who did really, really well with moderate load training really didn't do well with low load training. They experienced a ton of hypertrophy training in the 8 to 12 rep max range and experienced either much smaller gains in hypertrophy or even experienced decreases in lean soft tissue mass of the thighs following 12 weeks of low load training, and vice versa. Some people did really, really well with low load training and just really didn't get much, if anything, out of moderate load training. So it could simply be a matter of finding a training style that works well for you, which may not be the training style that works the best on average. And specifically to this conversation about low responders, high responders to training, non-responders to training, one thing we can do with the data in this study, since individual results were reported, is you can just look to see following 12 weeks of training, who would have been termed a low responder to training versus a high responder to training, just using a median split, like who got better gains than average versus who got worse gains than average. Well, not average, 50th percentile. You know what I'm saying. And then after 24 weeks, so after an additional 12 weeks of training, who was previously a high responder is now still a high responder versus who was a low responder, who is now a high responder, who was a low responder, who's still a low responder, who was a high responder, who's now a low responder. You know, just looking to see how many of those categorizations would have been shuffled up. And then also, during the first 12 weeks of training, how many people would have initially been termed non-responders who suddenly became responders after an additional 12 weeks of training with a different training style. And again, non-responder being defined here as people who experienced increases in lean soft tissue mass of the thigh that were smaller than the kind of technical measurement error of the machine being used. And so when you do that analysis, a full third of the people in this study, their high versus low responder classification would have flipped. So out of 24 total people in the study, 8 of them flipped. So either they were previously high responders after 12 weeks of training and became low responders after 24 weeks of training, or they were low responders after 12 weeks of training and became high responders after 24 weeks of training. And at times, this was actually pretty intense changes. So just looking at the individual results, following the full 24 weeks of training, the individuals in this study who experienced the third and fourth most total amount of hypertrophy following the full 24 weeks of training would have been classified as low responders following the first 12 weeks of training. So, that's just downstream of spending 12 weeks of training doing a style of training that they simply responded much, much better to than they did the style of training in the first 12 weeks. And then for responders versus non-responders, like in 12-week studies, we typically see that between like a quarter and a third of folks you would term non-responders, like people who experience gains in strength or gains in muscle mass smaller than kind of the typical measurement error, just day-to-day biological variability. And that's what we saw in this study after 12 weeks. So out of 24 subjects, 7 of them would have been termed non-responders. After the first 3 months of training, they experienced gains in lean soft tissue mass of the thighs that were smaller than the measurement error of the machine. After 24 weeks of training, only 2 people would have still been termed non-responders. So both continuing to train and finding a training style that worked better for them cut the non-response rate down from 7 out of 24 to 2 out of 24. So, it's I think that people on the whole do have maybe a bit too much faith in kind of the collective unconscious of the fitness community and not enough faith in their own experience and their ability to interpret their own experience. Like I see a lot of people who go online and say like, hey, I want to get stronger. What programs will help me do that? They look around, they find a program that a lot of people have done, generally has good reviews, seem to work well, and they do it, and it doesn't work particularly well for them. Either they don't get stronger at all, or they don't get much stronger, and they just kind of throw their hands up and say, well, this is a good program. It works. Like, it's worked for thousands of people. It didn't seem to work for me, so, man, like, I guess getting stronger just isn't in the cards. Whereas, like, I think probably a more productive thing to do would be either to look at kind of what the characteristics of that training program were, the overall level of volume, overall level of intensity, training frequency, and just say like, okay, that didn't work. Let's just do the opposite. Like, if it was a low volume program, let's try a high volume program. If it was a high intensity program, let's try a lower intensity program. And just basically start troubleshooting from there. Like, I know what didn't work. Let's just try something different and see if that works. Or, just kind of going back to the well and saying, hey, let's try to find another generally effective, pretty well-reviewed program that doesn't look anything at all like that one that didn't work for me. Like, that's, I think that more people should do that. Like, don't, so, I mean, and this can even go to levels that I don't want to sound mean, but to an extent that like I find I have a difficult time empathizing with. Like someone will start training and get on. Generally, it's just like a typical linear progression type program, like starting strength, strong lift, something like that, and they put in 2 years under the bar on a single training program, and like they've been hitting a wall, deloading, building back up, hitting a wall, deloading, building back up over that entire time span. Never built much muscle, never got particularly stronger, but it's like, well, people say these are good programs and I should be able to ride it to a 405 squat, and I only squat 220. So like, I guess I just need to keep doing this. And then, they just don't get there and decide like, oh, well, resistance training just isn't for me, or I must be fucking up and doing something wrong. I would say like the only thing you fucked up there is just sticking with a program for 2 years that clearly doesn't work for you.
Yeah.
Like I don't know. Like this is another rant, but I think that like there's been so much invective thrown the way of quote unquote program hoppers over the years, that now there are a lot of people who are afraid to ever change their training program.
Yeah.
And yeah, like sometimes you just need to change your training program.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because, you look at, you talked about, things you can do about it. Keep training, potentially train more, train harder. And those two approaches, someone who is very, someone who speaks very poorly of quote unquote program hoppers, they're hearing that and saying, hell yeah, that's exactly what I've been saying. But it is important to recognize that simply trying more than one thing does not make you a program hopper, right? So like, yeah, if you try a program and within the first 4 to 8 weeks it's not working, but you generally enjoy it, maybe that is a situation where you say, okay, well, maybe, try some modifications to do a little more, alter volume intensity, or maybe just stick with it for 8 more weeks and see if the needle starts moving. But yeah, like you said, I mean, the two things that do get a little bit baffling is the people who are 200 pounds away from their squat goal. They've been doing this program. It's got them like 10 pounds over the last year. And it's like, if you think you're going to make up the next 200 pounds, how is that going to occur? Like, unless you're going to be doing this for 40 years and like, that's the plan here, like just mathematically, how do you think doing the same thing with this rate of progress is going to get you to where your stated goal is?
Well, if scientists ever solve human aging, like,
yeah.
And now you have a 500-year runway, maybe.
Yeah, but you do sometimes see these situations where you're like, extrapolate out the gains you're getting. And if anything, they're going to get worse, not better over time if you keep doing, it should be somewhat logarithmic, generally speaking, doing the same exact approach. But yeah, you look at it and you're like, maybe program hopping, with a little caveat that you're giving the program enough time to do something. Maybe that's actually the right path forward. And like you said, there's also a tendency in the space for people to be so hung up on the collective understanding that they reject their own experience that's literally right in front of their eyes. And like, I have observed some internet chatter where someone's like, I tried this program that has less set volume than the going meta analysis that everyone likes, and it seemed to work for me, but that's impossible. And it's like, well, it's not though.
Yeah.
It literally happened.
Yeah.
And we should expect a great deal of variability from person to person because of all the reasons you've covered. So it is important that like some people are so dismissive of program hoppers that some people get locked into this area where they're like, well, whatever works for everyone has to be best for me. And if I ever change that, then I've demonstrated a lack of commitment to the program, which is bad.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're trying new training programs every 2 weeks, then you're a program hopper. Like you got to give it time to see if it's working. But if you've been on a program for 3 to 6 months, and you've given it a real honest shot and it's not doing much for you, try something else. Like that's not program hopping. That's like, I know this is an apocryphal quote, but the quote that's often attributed to Einstein, like insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different response. I think that applies here.
Yeah.
All right. And then the last thing that you could potentially do is take an even more expansive view of the benefits you would like to see from training, and or potentially not just try a different style of programming for a particular fitness outcome, but potentially just see if there's other forms of training that click better with you. So, for example, like you could very well be a low responder for strength and hypertrophy and still experience great improvements in blood pressure, blood lipids, bone health, mood, sleep, decreasing the rate of cognitive aging, improved blood glucose regulation, and probably a half dozen other things from continuing to train. So, like, you may not be seeing the gains in muscle mass that you want, or strength that you want, but training could still be doing a ton of other positive things for you that, like ultimately, I think that when you look back on it, as you're getting older, like you're probably not going to be like that resentful or upset that you weren't like the biggest guy at every gym you went into. But if you're, getting into your 70s and you're still in pretty good health, and you look around at some of your other peers who didn't really do much consistent exercise throughout their lifespan, and they're like, things are starting to go downhill for them a little bit, you'll say, you know what? I never got as big as I wanted to, but I'm glad I did all of that training.
Yeah.
And then for like on the topic of trying to maybe see if there's just an entirely different style of training that you respond well to and that you like. A study that I want to talk about by Caravirta and colleagues from 2011, individual responses to combined endurance and strength training in older adults. There were 53 there were 3 groups in this study. I'm only going to talk about one of them. But there was a group of 53 subjects who did 21 weeks of both resistance and endurance training. And there's a figure from the study that we can put up on the screen here if you're watching on YouTube. But just looking at the correlation in gains in VO2 peak and maximum voluntary contraction strength, I think of the quads is what they were measuring. There was no correlation at all between those two things. Like, people who responded well to endurance training or to the aerobic part of the intervention, like responding well in terms of gains in VO2 peak was completely unpredictive of whether you would also gain a lot of strength. If you gained a lot of strength, that was completely unpredictive of whether you'd experience large gains in aerobic fitness. And so, I think that oftentimes, like, I think a lot of this comes back to like motivation almost. Like, why are you training in the first place? Like, what are you hoping to get out of it? And like, I've talked to quite a few people who like had been lifting for a long, like they hit me up because they'd been lifting for a while and they just weren't seeing the responses to training that they wanted. And like I would be asking them like, hey, why are you doing this in the first place? Like, what are you hoping to achieve? And it's like, oh, well, I'm trying to get as muscular and strong as possible. And it's like, yeah, but why? Like, what's underpinning that? And like for a few of them, it was like, well, like I've heard that it's good for longevity. Like people who have more strength and more muscle mass when they hit like 50, 60 years old tend to have longer lifespans. Like ultimately, I'm just doing this to try to be healthy. So it's like, man, so first, you don't need to be a mass monster in the first place to do that. And second, like if you're hitting me up because you're so frustrated about the relatively poor responses you're seeing to resistance training, that like doing aerobic training is also good for longevity. Why don't you give that a shot? And a handful of them gave it a shot and they're like, you know what? Like, I don't know why I was lifting in the first place. I never particularly liked it. It wasn't fun. And guess what? I like biking or I like running. Thanks for putting me down this road. And so on one hand, kind of shooting myself in the foot because I don't put out aerobic training information. That is taking a potential future customer out of my revenue streams. But ultimately, I mean, I don't know, man. So ultimately, if you like lifting, like if you're coming at this from a like purely intrinsic motivation, like a lot of this shouldn't really be an issue in the first place. Like, maybe you would just like to see larger gains because you'd like to make larger gains. But if you have like a true intrinsic motivation here, especially if you're kind of like process oriented about it and you're lifting because you like to lift, you probably won't be the type of person who's getting like super, super frustrated about this. Because like whether or not you're getting super huge and super strong, like you're continuing to lift because you like to. If you've made it to this point in the video and you're still thinking like, man, like I really want to be as big and strong as possible, but like this is really frustrating because like I don't really even like lifting that much. I just want what I can get out of, or like what I've been told I will get out of lifting. I think at that point it may not be a terrible idea to just like assess motivation and see like, why are you doing this in the first place? Because I gotta tell you, like I also know plenty of people who do respond really well to training who just like didn't like training all that much. And guess what? They don't stick with training. Like they just don't. Like they get big and get strong and then just get bored of it in 5 years and say, yeah, like, fuck it. I never liked doing that. I'm going to stop.
And then for them, it becomes like a fun fact where later in life, they're like, oh, yeah, like 20 years ago, I was huge. Would you even believe it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you are like that frustrated, that does suggest, at least to some extent, a lack of like process-oriented intrinsic motivation. So if you're going down that road, it probably wouldn't be a terrible idea to just try some completely different form of exercise that, regardless of the gains you get from it, you just like doing it. It's fun, and so you're going to be much more likely to stick with it. And there is a decent chance that if you're frustrated because of the lack of gains you're getting to resistance training, you very well could respond very well to some other form of exercise. Like, maybe you've been lifting for 2 or 3 years. You're not particularly big. You're not particularly strong. You start doing some aerobic training, and 6 months later, you have a very competitive 5K time. Like that may just be a more productive road to go down.
Yeah. And I think this conversation about broadening your horizons about what training can look like and what it can bring you, that really resonates with me in a way that really didn't have anything to do with being frustrated with my response to training. Like, you know, that I've had a thing going on for quite some time now with kind of like a nerve entrapment that has made it very, very difficult to do just about any squat or deadlift variations without a pretty substantial amount of pain. Like the type of pain that actually isn't just like achy, but really alters kind of day-to-day enjoyment of life.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I had the road to Athens segment where I was like, oh, maybe I'll get back into long distance running. Now, unfortunately, that aggravated the exact same thing. And so eventually that became similarly frustrating, but it was the same idea of like, can I find a way to do exercise that is enjoyable and brings me some of these benefits? Like, obviously it's not going to make me huge, but how will it affect my mood, my sleep, aging, things like that. So, whether you're running into frustration because of, lack of progress, being dissatisfied with your gains, or you're running into frustration because of the way you like to train is currently not compatible with what makes you feel good, and you have to make some adjustments, whether they're temporary or permanent, pertaining to some limitations. It is sometimes helpful to go back to the drawing board and have a broader scope of what exercise looks like and what it can do for you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think just on kind of like a meta level, I think that it's worth asking, like, whether you plan on like competing in anything. Because like if you do, then it is probably worth being at least a little concerned about like, oh, like how large are the gains I'm experiencing? How do my results stack up to other people? But like, if not, the thing is like exercise is just good. Aerobic exercise is good. Group exercise is good. Resistance exercise is good. Like, it's just good to find things that get you moving. And so if you don't have like competitive aspirations in any particular strength, physique sport, aerobic sport, like anything, just find things you enjoy doing. And that should, I mean, that should take care of a lot of it. I mean, yeah, like there have been plenty of things in my, I think a pretty good example for me, at least like historically, is basketball. Like I've made no bones about it. Basketball is my favorite sport. I like the way they dribble up and down the court. Little throwback for the 90s kids listening. But like,
that was a great lyric, by the way. Who was that? Lil Bow Wow?
That was Lil Bow Wow. Yeah. That was, I think from Like Mike.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, dude, I'm like 5'10" on a good day. And I'm like relatively fast, can jump reasonably well, have reasonably good hand-eye coordination. But like once I got onto like the AAU circuit and like higher levels of basketball, like, I mean, I didn't pick the right parents for it. And so, like I went from being among the better players in like youth leagues I played in and like for the school I played at, to being like one of the worst players. And, on some of the teams I was on, I didn't get that much time off of the bench, but like, I don't know, I didn't care. It was boring to sit on the bench during the games, but I mean, practice was still sick, like, because I just love playing basketball. And so like, yeah, like I had a strong intrinsic motivation to keep doing it, even though at least at that level, the results that I was seeing for the work I was putting in were way, way smaller than those of my peers. But I was like, this is fine because I just like doing it. It's fun.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and I think one of the things that helped me a lot with that is like, I was competitive in the in the sense of like, this is a sport. They're keeping score. There's a winner and a loser. But by that time, like in high school, I already had the mindset of like, I can see where I'm at in this sport. Like, I'm not getting a D1 scholarship to play at the next level. I'm certainly not going pro. So like, I'm doing this for fun, and it's a good time. And so like, yeah, that's a perspective just to keep in mind. Like, if you're doing something to compete, might be worth comparing yourself against others. If you're really just doing it for personal satisfaction, longevity, whatever, just find things you like doing. And if what you like doing that gets you active differs from what someone on the internet is saying you should be doing, just ignore them, because there's an extremely good chance they're wrong. Like, whatever sort of exercise you like is almost assuredly good exercise.
Yep.
All right, so let's just wrap this up.
Let's do it.
Just a little recap here, and some implications. So the first thing, going all the way back to the beginning, is almost no matter what you're experiencing in the gym, if you're concerned, man, like I think there's something wrong with me, like things don't seem to be going right, just take a deep breath. It's okay. There is an incredibly good chance that whatever you're experiencing is completely normal, completely okay, completely fine. There's just a tremendous degree of variability in terms of the responses people see to training. That is like the variability is larger than I think people realize. And whatever you're experiencing is probably within 2 standard deviations of the mean. Very normal shit. It's just people experience very different responses to training. And that applies to both above and below average responses. Like, if you think like, oh shit, like am I the god of resistance training because I've only been lifting 6 months and I squat 405? Like, no, probably not. Like, you're doing better than average, but you're probably like that is also perfectly normal as well. Like, it's above average, but that's not an outlier response. Whatever you're experiencing is probably just normal and fine. The next thing is like, just keep in mind as you're out there on the internet, or even in the gym, like what you see on a day-to-day basis that you might be comparing yourself against is almost assured to be a skewed sample. So like, that's clearly true for social media. Like the people who pop up in your Discover feed or whatever for physique sports, strength sports, whatever, those are almost always people who just have very above average responses to resistance training. Folks find that interesting. That's why they get more likes. That's why the algorithms are serving them to you. So what you come across online is an extremely skewed sample, and if you're using that to set your expectations, there's a decent chance you'll probably wind up disappointed. And think that even if you're having like the perfectly average response to training, you will still perceive it to be below average because it's below the average of what you're seeing on social media on a day-to-day basis. But what you're seeing on social media is a severely skewed sample. But even like what you see in the gym is probably, at least to some extent, a skewed sample as well. Like, if you go in the weight room and most people at your gym who you see lifting weights all the time, if they tend to be quite a bit larger or stronger than you, like, that is probably also a skewed sample. Because the thing is, like, folks tend to self-select into the forms of exercise they respond well to. And so if you're seeing the same regulars going to the gym all the time over months or years, those people who stick with training are generally people who have, on average, above average responses to training. And that's probably why they stick with it compared to some other form of exercise. And this generalizes as well. Like, the people who, like, if you go down to a local 5K, like not even some sort of like super prestigious track and field event, the people competing in that 5K probably have at least slightly better responses to aerobic training than the average person does, which is why they're the type of person who runs 5Ks and likes doing that. So Yeah, don't be hard on yourself, and just keep in mind that what you're seeing, like, there's a pretty decent chance that you are being too hard on yourself and thinking that what you're experiencing is further below average than it actually is. Like, plenty of and this is true for competitors as well. Like, plenty of powerlifters who aren't even that competitive at local meets may be great responders to resistance training. It's just they're not great responders to resistance training compared to other people who compete in this sport. So just keep all of that in mind. Like, there is a very good chance that you are doing better than you think you are. Then I think that another like implication here is that, like, there's a tendency, I think, for people to give excessive deference to people who are particularly strong or who have a particularly good physique. Like, people just assume that, like, yeah, if this person is really strong and jacked, they must know what they're talking about. Or if someone isn't as strong and isn't as jacked as someone else, like, oh, like, they either don't know what they're talking about or they're just not putting in the work. And, like, I do think that is probably directionally true on some level. Like, I think if you took the entire universe of people who deadlift 800 pounds and the entire universe of people who deadlift 200 pounds, that's not a great example. 400 pounds. The 800 pound deadlifters do probably know more about deadlifting on average than the 400 pound deadlifters do. Generally, just because, I mean, they've been doing it longer. If they're probably competing if they pull 800 pounds, so they've probably devoted more time and headspace into thinking about it and whatnot. So, like, there is probably that rough correlation, but it's not nearly as strong of a correlation as I think a lot of people assume. Like, there are a lot of very, very bright lifters and coaches who just didn't have the best genetic draw for lifting, and they know what they're doing. They're good they know how to train themselves, or if they're coaches, they know how to train other people, but, like, they're not gonna squat 800, bench 500, whatever, just because they didn't pick the right parents for it. And that's totally fine. So don't immediately assume someone either isn't training hard or don't know what they're talking about just because they're not freaky huge, freaky jacked, super strong. And conversely, don't automatically assume someone knows what they're talking about because they are super strong or super jacked. Like, there are plenty of people who just picked tremendously good parents for resistance training who don't have any fucking idea what they're doing. They just lucked into a good situation. And then finally, just to recap, like, if you are struggling with your results, some things that you could try to get things moving in the right direction. 1, make sure you have your ducks in a row outside the gym. 2, just keep training. Small gains do still add up over time. 3, if you have the motivation and capacity to do so, in general, if you train more or train harder, that will tend to lead to better results. 4, measure more variables, like, strength might be going well, even if you're not building a ton of muscle, or vice versa. 5, experiment with different training styles. This does not conflict with continuing to train. You can train more, you can train harder, you can keep training, but if none of that's working, just try training differently. There might be a different style of training that you respond well to that maybe does differ from the norms, and trust your own experiences there, and don't be afraid to experiment and troubleshoot. Finally, like, embrace the other benefits of training beyond purely physical capacity / body shape. Those gains in health markers, longevity, mental health, sleep, etc. Like, those are real tangible benefits that you can see from training, even if you're not putting on all of the muscle you want to. Like, it is still doing beneficial things for you. And if you feel like you're banging your head against the wall and you're not seeing the results you want, and you just don't like the training you're doing, there is absolutely nothing wrong with just trying to find a different overall style of training that you both respond better to and that you just like doing more, that you find more kind of intrinsic enjoyment in. And ultimately that's going to be much more strongly predictive of whether you do it for a long time and whether you stick with it long enough to see notable benefits, both physically and in terms of, mental health, longevity, all of that other good stuff.